at least listen to the presentation. So what we are going to do is to move the presentation one after the other and have a discussion after the presentation. So so maybe we can stop the very next picture, so we can show it later. So last session is about projecting vulnerability through the lens of human capital, and we look into the future. And we have two presentations. The first one, Erich Striessnig, and so you have the floor.
Should I take this one? Okay, thank you, Leiwen. Since already at my young age I have a reputation for talking way too long on my opening slides and then having no time left for the later interesting slides, this time I want to do it the other way around and keep it short at the beginning, especially since a lot of what I was going to say in the opening slides has been discussed already during the last 2 days. My talk is entitled Future Differential Vulnerability to Natural Disasters by Level of Education. And what I'm planning to do in this, what I'm trying to show in this presentation, first of all, is a brief summary of the shared socioeconomic pathways and what Wolfgang called in his opening presentation the human core of those SSPs. These SSPs, as has already been mentioned, are supposed to replace the previous IPCC's special report on emission scenarios, which have so far been used for assessing future levels of emissions. But in contrary to these stress scenarios, the SSPs are much more detailed on the population heterogeneity, and they include the full population detail by age, sex, and also educational attainment. But what's important here also is why are they called shared socioeconomic pathways? Because the idea behind creating these scenarios that through the global integrated assessment modeling community was to provide a common framework for assessing future developments as diverse as future output growth or human development, as Jesus is going to talk about in this session, or urbanization, as Leiwen has shown in some of his previous work. So I want to just briefly talk about the 5 different SSPs, and then in part B, I want to use previous work that I've done together with Wolfgang and Anthony Pat, another colleague from YASA, on the socio-demographic determinants of differential vulnerability to natural disasters, and eventually the aim is to apply the B on the A. So show what these shared socioeconomic pathways mean in terms of differential vulnerability to natural disasters. But first, let me just briefly remind you of the shared socioeconomic pathways. This picture, Wolfgang already showed it at the beginning, shows you the adaptation mitigation space. So the further we go to the right on the x-axis, the adaptation challenges increase. The further we go up on the y-axis, the mitigation challenges increase. What you have here in the center is the so-called middle of the road scenario, which in demographic terms corresponds to medium assumptions for fertility, mortality, and migration. And of course, this also leads to intermediate challenges for both adaptation and mitigation. In the lower left corner, you have SSP1, where both challenges to adaptation and mitigation are minimized. This is in a way the most optimistic scenario, where we experience a global reduction in inequality. This scenario is also has also been labeled the sustainability scenario to distinguish it especially from SSP5, which I will talk about just in a moment, which is conventional development. The sustainable development in SSP1 will be accompanied by a rapid expansion in educational attainment, which will lead to a high rate of technological progress, a rapid demographic transition, and as a consequence of that, comparatively small overall population level. If we look at the upper right corner of the picture I just showed you, we have the SSP3, which is like the extreme other end. So this is the most pessimistic scenario, also called fragmentation, because in this scenario we experience a very divided world, where both the mitigation and the adaptation challenges are maximized in comparison to the other scenarios. And this is also a consequence on the demographic side of a stalled education transition. Very little progress is made as a consequence in the demographic transition, which means that we have very unevenly distributed population growth. So especially the high fertility countries of today will continue to grow very rapidly. And world population will reach its maximum in this scenario. Needless to say, for the lack of cooperation in this very fragmented world, migration is not going to play a big role in SSP3. SSP4, on the other hand, is quite similar to SSP3, but it is less challenging in terms of mitigation. Although equally, very challenging in terms of adaptation as well. This is simply because a large fraction of the world population in this scenario is left behind in abject poverty with very low levels of education. And this is of course going to have a similar effect on the demographic transition. It will also stagnate, and we will see higher levels of population growth from today's developing world. But what's important here is that a large fraction of the global population in this scenario will be left behind, and due to their very small income, they will not even dispose of the means, of the necessary means to make a large contribution to CO2 emissions, for example. And therefore, mitigation challenges will be rather smaller. But since these people are so poor in this scenario and less educated and have a smaller ability to cope, the adaptation challenges are still very high in this scenario. And then finally, we have SSP5 in the upper left corner, which corresponds to conventional development. So this is pretty much a scenario where more of the same, meaning more economic growth, is supposed to lead to the solution of all problems. But of course, even though this leads to continuous growth in all parts of the world, and the poorer countries catch up to some extent, it is also much more challenging in terms of mitigation, because these formerly poorer countries will also catch up to the consumerist lifestyles that we see in the richer parts of the world today. So this fast economic growth throughout the world, which is happening not in a sustainable way, drives mitigation challenges. Education, on the other hand, will be expanding. As a consequence of that, we will not see so strong population growth, but this is also because it will be increasingly challenging for the people in today's developing world to mitigate or to bring together family and work. So they will be very much challenged by the same challenges as the OECD countries already today. The overall effect on world population then is mixed. Here you see a more detailed picture of what these 5 SSPs translate to in terms of overall population in thousands. These are 6 major world regions, not 5, sorry for that. I had to put them on different scales because most of the action in terms of population growth here is going to happen in Africa and Asia. And you would not really see much change in the other regions if you were to put them on the same scale. But this is pretty much just to show you how large a range of different results in terms of overall population we get from these SSPs. But of course, not just overall population changes, also within these societies, the different SSPs lead to very, very different kinds of distributions. So you see as an example here, Africa in 2100. the 5 SSPs next to each other. As you can see in SSP1, yeah, it's, some of you might probably wonder why SSP1 and SSP5 look so similar, but the simple reason for that is that these two scenarios are only different, for Africa at least, with regard to migration. And since, in any case, a maximum of 25% of one cohort can migrate, and in these two scenarios, future generations are going to be smaller because of the lower fertility, migration is not going to have such a huge impact. Well, it will have a big impact, but this is remember that this is the aggregate of Africa, and a lot of the migration is actually happening within Africa, and so this difference in migration does not really amount to such a large overall difference in these pictures. SSP2 is the middle of the road, so that is that corresponds to the central scenario in the Wittgenstein Center's population projections by age, sex, and education. And then you have the fragmentation scenario where you have a disaster right there, where you have an enormous fraction of the population left behind, in red here with no education at all. Orange is primary education, and then you have some people already with secondary and even tertiary education, but in comparison to SSP1 and SSP2, that share is rather small. SSP4 is quite similar to SSP3. It reaches a slightly lower level of population in Africa, but you can see the inequality here is bigger. You see that the blue parts are bigger, meaning more people have already a tertiary education, but at the same time also there are more people who have absolutely no or only primary education. This brings us to part B of my presentation, where I want to start out with the question of how to save many lives, and on top of that, even quite some money. In its World Synthesis report, the World Bank in 2010 has estimated the adaptation cost due to climate change until the annual adaptation cost due to climate change at around $70 to $100 billion. This large uncertainty about the exact cost also reflects the large uncertainty about the exact effect climate change is going to have in specific locations. Because in fact we still know very little about where exactly what is going to happen at which time. And this, of course, poses a challenge for investments into climate protective infrastructure, because, of course, this is a lot of money, and especially in times of economic hardship, financial crisis, the global community has to think very thoroughly about where to invest that money. And so the idea is not new, that rather than focusing on very specific interventions that would only have a benefit if climate change really plays out in one particular predicted way, instead of investing in these very specific interventions, one should rather focus on increasing the general capacity of future societies to adapt to a changing climate. So as a consequence of that, you already have a vast body of literature, which I'm not going to talk about in much detail, which is integrating these adaptation strategies into broader strategies of development. But it is quite remarkable that none of these studies is really looking at education as a possible intervention in particular. So why do we think that education, or why do I think that education has such a strong impact? Well, Wolfgang has already talked about this in his opening remarks also. It leads to empowerment, particularly for those who are most disadvantaged, and as a consequence of that also most vulnerable to climate change, and thus reduces inequality. Education, if you're able to read and write, it also leads to better access to relevant information, but also cognitive skills are enhanced, and it leads to, as studies have shown, it leads to less risky behavior. We have seen in several studies, for example in Emilio's presentation, how risky behavior can cause a lot of excess death. but it also leads to a longer personal planning horizon, which becomes important in long-term decision making, like where to build a house, for example. Raya has spoken about that. And then, of course, there is also the enhanced capacity to learn from past damage. So one disaster has already happened, and it has been shown that people with higher levels of education are more likely to actually react on that. In addition to that, on the social level, there are improvements on general health and physical well-being, but also income is increased, and all of that together should, of course, have an impact on disaster vulnerability. This has recently also been emphasized by a special issue in ecology and society. I just want to emphasize some selected examples here, which find effects of education, which I find particularly strong effects of education. Raya and her colleagues have been working on data from Thailand, where they find that villages with a better educated population are more likely to be better prepared and also more likely to anticipate future threats. Samir, on the other hand, using Nepali data, found that there is a stronger impact of education in reducing damage than the impact of physical wealth and income. Frankenberg et al. Were looking at the pre-tsunami and post-tsunami Sumatra, and found that 5 years after the tsunami, the more highly educated are actually also of better psychosocial health. So this is another important dimension of coping. And then there are studies dealing with migration, which show that education is also quite important for opening up that possibility of coping. One study where I was involved personally, it's a study together with my colleague Adelheid Pichler from the University of Vienna, deals with the case of Cuba. Cuba is probably a rather unexpected example when it comes to disaster preparedness, but when you look at the data, you see that in the past, although Cuba has been suffering from quite a high number of natural disasters, just like its Caribbean neighbors, the Dominican Republic and Haiti, if you look at the picture on the left here, the total number of deaths from natural disasters has been far lower in Cuba than in these other two island states. Ever since you see the high red bar in the on the very left side here. This was Hurricane Flora in 1963, which for Cubans, this was right after the revolution, became kind of a tipping point for social change. So since Hurricane Flora had quite a strong impact and caused about 1,200 deaths, there are several different estimates of how many people actually died. But this led to an unprecedented literacy campaign throughout Cuba with very vast social participation. So really in the communities, those people who were able to write and read and write helped those who were not to start learning reading and writing. And within only 1 year, if these accounts are true, about 700,000 people were lifted out of illiteracy. And these important efforts were continued until today, such that Cuba now stands out in the developing world as one of the countries with the most highly educated population. And you can see that here on the picture, in the picture on the right, where Cuba is very far to the right, right on the line describing the linear trend between my education variable here, the share of women aged 20 to 39 with at least secondary education, and the log of the total number of deaths to the initial population. Whereas the Dominican Republic and Haiti lag far behind and have far less educated population. But of course, you have to control for many other covariates. So if you want to look at this relationship between education and disaster vulnerability, and so here I present an updated version of previous results stemming from an analysis I conducted together with Wolfgang and Tony Pett. And as you can see here, first of all, I present 7 different models here because, of course, GDP per capita, infant mortality as a proxy for the health system in a country and education are quite correlated. And so I present different models where I take different combinations of these three variables at a time. And as you can see here, the female education variable is found to be significant in all specifications, highly significant actually, whereas the income variable is not significant in any of these. At the same time, since we are going to produce projections based on these estimations, the main concern has to be with insignificant variables in the model, because these are going to inflate the uncertainty ranges of our projections. And so I end up using model 7 here, also because the selection, the model selection criteria down here, AIC, BIC, recommend to do so. So finally, as I recommended, announced at the beginning, I'm applying the results from B to the shared socioeconomic pathways, and what you have here finally is the projected future decadal number of deaths in thousands for the 6 different world regions. These are of course still very preliminary results, and I need to look into them more. I need to spend more time looking into them. I haven't really had much time to do that, but you will probably see that there are many kinks here in Europe, for example, but also in other regions. This is because I'm calculated the number of deaths first for individual for sub-regions within these larger SSP regions, and different sub-regions within the larger regions turn from positive growth to negative growth in different decades, and therefore you see these kinks, these breaks here at times. At the same time, there are also some breaks crossings in the trajectories, which is also due to these sub-regions from which I aggregate. Yeah, I'm actually sorry. You were just talking about the importance of disaggregating, and now I'm aggregating everything and even using the national level CRED data. The later versions of the paper will hopefully be more advanced. Since there are no estimations as of yet on what the different SSPs are going to mean in terms of concrete numbers of future disasters by world region, in this picture I had to assume a constant hazard, meaning the hazard of the last decade is constant over the coming decade. And this is actually also the reason why you see the number of deaths in Europe to be so much higher than in Northern America, thank you, because in the 2000 to 2010 period there was a tremendous heat wave in Europe which killed thousands and thousands of people, and in addition to that, as you may have seen in the overall population results already, Europe is actually much more than the European Union in the SSPs. It also includes Russia, and so the deaths are much more. But since, according to most serious climatologists, climate change is going to affect the number of extreme weather events, and we are very most likely going to see quite a tremendous increase in these extreme weather events. I also did a very rough job here in calculating the future number of deaths per decade, assuming a very conservative doubling of the number of deaths until the end of the century. I just want to highlight here that even, well, already in the baseline scenario where we assume constant hazard, the range between the very optimistic SSP1 scenario, where people are very resilient, have very strong adaptive capacity, and the very pessimistic SSP3 and SSP4 scenarios is quite large in Africa. But if you assume a stronger impact in terms of the frequency of natural extreme events in the future, then the range of between these scenarios is going to go up enormously. And this leads me to my conclusions. Over the coming decades, as I have said, large amounts of money will have to be spent on adaptation programs, but it's yet not really clear what would be the best way of making, what would be the best use of this money. And what I have tried to do here is to present education as a new policy focus to reduce social differential vulnerability and increase adaptive capacity to climate change. Because as we have seen from the results, from the predicted number of casualties, it is very, very important that the world evolves rather according to SSP1, the very optimistic sustainable development scenario, rather than SSP3, the fragmentation, or SSP4, the inequality scenario. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Erika, for the excellent presentation and very interesting research. And we are doing fine in time. And if you have a burning question asking for clarification, you can ask now. Otherwise, please reserve your question after the second presentation. Okay, so we move to the last, but absolutely not least, presentation for the whole workshop. Has a Crespo, Cuaresma, and Wolfgang Lutz. Okay, thank you. So you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. Thanks the organizers and in particular Raya. I'm going to stand up because I have to move. So I'm going to present a paper with a slightly pretentious title called The Demography of Human Development and Climate Change Vulnerability, a Projection Exercise. I don't know if you're familiar with popular British music of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, but ranging back from David Bowie to the Smiths and the Wedding Present, they used to have extremely pretentious titles for actually very beautiful small pop nuggets. It's pretty much what I'm going to be doing here. So this is going to be a little pop jangly guitar jewel where I'm just putting together much of the projection work that we have been doing at the Wittgenstein Center into projections of the Human Development Index. So that's basically the idea of this. I think, let me use this. I think that this is the type of crowd that I don't have to convince that development determines vulnerability to natural hazards. We've been talking about it for 3 days. So the basic idea and the motivation of this paper was that when you're trying to have a look at the effects of climate change on vulnerability, or how ready our country is going to be in order to face the challenges of climate change in terms of natural disasters, people in the literature tend to compare values of income per capita, education, human development index of today to eventual futures. And what we're trying to do here is just to bring together all the projections that have been going on at the Wittgenstein Center in order to create human development index projections for each one of those SSPs that you just heard about, in order to be able to compare vulnerability in the framework of existing projection methods, and in order eventually to put it into integrated assessment models. The choice of the Human Development Index, as criticized as it is in many cases, is just based on the fact that most of the literature uses it and tends to find that there is a nice correlation between vulnerability to disasters and the development in general, and in this case, the Human Development Index. You have here a couple of papers that do that. Erich himself has been doing it. Wolfgang and Tony Pat in the PNAS did it in 2010 also. You're going to see a couple of graphs of that paper in a minute. As I told you, the humble aim of this paper is just to develop a framework in order to obtain projections of the Human Development Index. So as you may know, you're going to see it in a second, the Human Development Index has 3 components. One of them is based on health and mostly on life expectancy developments. The other one is based on education. You just saw pretty much what we are going to do there. And the other one is based on income per capita, of which I will tell you a little bit more about how we did those projections, because those are the ones that have not been at least obviously presented until now. Okay, I will also present HDI projections up to the year 2075 for the 5 SSPs that we heard about. Okay, if you have a look at the literature, the measurement of development, which is such an abstract concept, has been materialized in the use of many different variables, from income per capita to population density, fertility, access to drinking water, governance indicators. What has become more of a fashion in the literature is to use the Human Development Index, pretty much due to this type of results that you can see in here. So what you have on the y-axis, in this case, is the part of the people affected by disasters that cannot be explained through population and other socio-demographic variables. And here you have the Human Development Index. And as you can see, there's overall a negative relationship, and that there is a certain non-linearity, implying that it's up to certain levels of development where you start to see improvements in or a decrease of vulnerability to disasters. It's not as clear if you go to the deaths instead of to the affected, but there's still a significant relationship and significant negative relationship going on, at least for high levels of the Human Development Index. Okay, so it has been actually found to be a good way to put together into one number a kind of an overall measure of development. Now, as I told you, I'm going to be interested in the Human Development Index and in forecasting it or in projecting it. As you can see, the Human Development Index is just a geometric mean of 3 indices. You have the index that corresponds to income, the index that corresponds to life expectancy, and the index that corresponds to education. I'm not going to talk very much about these two, because pretty much what Erich presented is how we are doing it. We have population projections by sex, age, and education. We know life expectancy differentials across age groups and education groups. So eventually it's going to be really easy to get those two numbers, at least within the framework. And then what's going to be more challenging is how to, still within the context of human capital-driven development, how to link that to movements in economic growth. That's pretty much my job as the economist in the gang. Okay. Let me go just briefly into how each one of these sub-indices are composed, are created. It's extremely simple. The health component of the Human Development Index is just an index where you normalize the life expectancy based on the minimal life expectancy observed over the existing data, and you normalize it by the range of life expectancy so that the number is between 0 and 1. So given a maximum level and a minimum level of life expectancy, it's just a linear function of life expectancy. As you saw through Erich's presentation, I'm so happy that he presented all that stuff before, because it makes my job much easier. You can actually, given differentials of life expectancy across all the groups and all the colors that you saw before, you can just get the number for each one of the SSPs. Needless to say, as you move to the future, you need to update the fact that, the Human Development Index is just a relative number. The best country is going to be always 1. So you will need to be updating each one of these sub-indices in such a way that the maximum observed life expectancy becomes the new one. So basically this guy here, in reality, in our projections, is going to have also a little t, and it's going to be updated all the time. For the case of the education component, it's slightly more complex, but still very easy to follow. It has 2 components in itself, so it's a geometric mean of 2 components. One of them is the mean years of schooling of the country, and the other one is something called expected years of schooling, which is, as you can imagine, just a function of school enrollment. So the idea is, what would be the years of schooling that a child born at that moment is expected to have during its life. So it's basically given by the enrollment rates at that moment or by the projected enrollment rates. As you saw before, we have all those things. I mean, we have them in terms of shares of people with primary, secondary, and tertiary education, so we just need to transform that into mean years of schooling, which is not a big problem. And then we can also project the expected years of schooling in the sense of being the projected values in 25 years. Okay, so that they are also consistent within each one of the SSPs. As I told you here, Wolfgang and Samir have already done that. One way or another, Erich has also been using them and presented them before. And the index for income, which probably will require a little bit more of explaining. In terms of the sub-index of income, it's exactly the same as the one of life expectancy. So we're going to have exactly the same type of idea. You have income per capita. It's measured in gross national income per capita in 2005 international dollars, at least in the 2010 Human Development Index. You standardize so that it's between 0 and 1 by dividing by the range of income per capita as observed. What we are going to do, of course, these numbers are fixed in the Human Development Index right now. What we will do as we project it is update the maximum one. Okay? And now the idea is going to be, well, how can we link all the changes in population by age, sex, and education to the development of income per capita in a country? Okay? The fully fledged model with 1,000 robustness checks and everything is in a paper of mine. However, I'm going to tell you basically how we did it, or a little bit of the background of how we did it. Now comes the economist talk, so I'm sorry about it. Usually I don't have to apologize for being an economist, but in some audiences I have to. It's a problem of interdisciplinarity, right? So the idea is extremely simple. If you again back to the 70s and to David Bowie, if you were to ask somebody in the 1970s about how to put education into an economic growth model, they would tell you that, well, that's relatively easy. People with different levels of education have different levels of labor productivity, so they are like different types of input of the production process. So just put them, instead of having one labor input, which is just the average person, just have several labor inputs that correspond to each one of those persons with some level of education. So basically we're going to start there. This is still 1970s. We're going to start there, and we're going to assume that total output is a function of the capital stock, of course, and of that disaggregated labor input. So that's labor by level of education and by age. So we're going to have, in this case, just two broad age groups, basically 15 to 35 and over 35. Again, million of robustness checks. It doesn't really matter if you take 40. So we're going to have an old group and an young, or an older group, or a younger group, and we're going to have labor without education, with primary education, with secondary education, with tertiary education. Okay? Now, if you take this production, and you have, of course, total factor productivity, which is going to be basically the technological progress making all the inputs of production become more productive over time. This usually in theoretical models is assumed to, or in old exogenous growth theoretical models, it's assumed to grow at an exogenous rate, so basically everybody is getting more productive over time. If we take that production function and just log it and take the first difference, then we have basically a specification for economic growth. Here you have the growth rate of output being a function of the growth rate of technology, the growth rate of capital, which is related to investment, and the growth rates of each one of those disaggregated labor inputs. Okay, the problem with this model as such is that education, or what appeared clear in the literature then in the 90s, is that education in this model only creates level effects in income per capita. It does not accelerate growth rates of income per capita in the long run, which is something that we may imagine that education can also do. Since here education only affects your productivity and not the total factor productivity, then you're going to end up with a model where changes in education are just creating level effects in your income per capita, but not changing the long-run growth rate. We skip to the 90s, and in the 90s, the so-called Nelson-Phelps paradigm entered economic growth theory by precisely including this idea that education does much more than just making you more productive. It also affects your ability to create or to adopt technology and make the whole economy or all inputs of production, including those that are not just your education group, more productive. The idea is extremely simple, or when it comes to specifying a model like that, we took a very simple specification, and we said that the growth rate of technology is going to depend, notice, not in the increases in human capital, that is, as the other part, which are the changes in those groups, but on the actual human capital stock that you have, that is on the shares of people with several education levels. So the more human capital you have, the higher the likelihood that you will create new inventions that improve your technology. You tend to see that people that create inventions actually on average tend to have more education than those that don't create it. So the basic idea is that education also makes you a more creative person, and therefore helps you improve the technology of a country. That is one of the effects that go through human capital on technology growth. The other one is related to the fact that relatively poorer countries, in the sense of countries which are farther away from the technology frontier, are going to be able to grow quicker just by catching up on old technologies which are already available but that have not been adopted by that country yet. Now, education plays also an extremely important role, historically and empirically, in how quickly that adoption process takes place. If you think of East Asia in the 80s, part of the idea of the extremely high growth rates of income per capita here was based on the fact that you had a very skilled labor that was able to adopt technologies through imitation and actually be able to re-export them and so on. So the other part, or the other way in which education is affected the growth rate of technology is going to be through the interaction of how educated you are and how rich you are, how far away from the technological frontier you are. So the idea is, if you're very far away from the technological frontier, but you have a relatively high level of education, you will be able to catch up quicker than if it's not the case. Okay? And then you have a part which is autonomous in terms of there is a catching up to the technological frontier independent of your level of education. So you have the level of education affecting how quickly you are moving to the technological frontier, and thinking about more advanced economies by how much the technology frontier itself is moving through new technologies. If you put the two things together, you take this guy and you plug this big guy, then you get to a specification that is telling you, hey, if you want to explain the growth rates of GDP, just regress them on the one hand, the growth rates of each one of those education age groups, on their shares, on their stocks, on the human capital stocks, on the interaction of the human capital stock, and how far away you are from the frontier, that is how poor you are, how rich you are, and the same thing in here, right? And of course the growth rate of the capital stock, which, as you will see, we will then basically project in a relatively standard way. Okay, so we took this model, we took data for 120 countries over the period 1970 to 2010 at 5-year intervals. Needless to say, we could only do this thanks to the reconstruction efforts that took place at the Wittgenstein Center in order to create those education age groups. And we basically run a regression. We have done several papers dealing with this type of thing. So you have, as you can imagine, you have a big problem of multicollinearity in there, because you have many age groups, you have many education levels. We have come across this problem differently in each one of the papers that we have done, because we wanted to try different things. So in some cases we have used shrinkage estimators, in some other cases we have used principal components. Here, this is the simplest possible case. We have used general to specific model selection. So basically we start with a big model full of inflated parameter estimates, and then we start to get rid of one at a time until we arrive at a model that we are happy with. Again, the other type of model selection methods lead to models which are comparable, or whose results are comparable. If we concentrate on the very last model, which is the one that we are actually going to use, it only contains significant variables, with the exception of the capital stock, which is not really significant, but it has the type of value that you would expect from theory. If you concentrate on that model, you can see, first of all, the parameter estimate associated to the initial level of income per capita is negative. That implies that there is conditional convergence. The poorer you are, given the other variables, the poorer you are, the farther away you are from your equilibrium, the quicker that you converge to it. However, and now we go here to the interaction between the share of working age population with tertiary schooling and initial income per capita. As you can see, it's also negative and relatively high, actually, compared to this guy. That implies that if you compare two countries who are the same poor, that the one that has a higher level of tertiary schooling is the one that is going to catch up quicker to the technological frontier. Okay? Now you have extra effects also of secondary and tertiary schooling, and the typical pure productivity effects are coming from young age secondary schooled people, and this is something also that we found in another setting in our science paper, or paper in science, is that the primary education of the older generation, so this mixture of primary education and experience, tends to be also a first factor affecting, short-term affecting economic growth. So what we did is extremely simple. We took these numbers and we plugged in the data that you saw from Erich before. And we just needed to, on top of that, to bring some of the narratives of the shared socioeconomic pathways into the story. Because of course, the human capital dynamics that were presented before and these parameters were not enough to reflect the whole qualitative narratives concerning things like between country convergence and stuff like that. So basically, well, you know that. Basically, we calibrated the model for each one of the SSPs using two different extra parameters. We still have a degree of freedom in the sense of that we can play around with the movements of the frontier which are independent of human capital. The model is a panel data set, so we had country fixed effects and time fixed effects. The country fixed effects are unobservables in a country that affect economic growth and don't change over time, so we're going to think about that as institutions and culture or whatever. And we had the time fixed effects that affect all countries in every period of time. We're going to think of that as shocks to the technological frontier that are independent of human capital. So with those guys, with the frontier growth, we can play. So we basically calibrated it to numbers that represented those qualitative narratives from the SSPs, on the one hand. And then with the fixed effects that we obtained at the country level, we also could replicate part of the dynamics which were expected in terms of convergence or divergence or lack of convergence or divergence of institutional settings within countries that would create then this idea of having not only within country convergence to an equilibrium, but also between country convergence in equilibria. Okay? So we took all these things, plugged in the data, and this is what comes out. I don't know if you're familiar with beam plots. This is a beam plot. I discovered them a couple of months ago, and I'm completely in love with them. Not only me, but all my PhD students, because I don't know how to do them, so I give it to them and they do them. This is a beam plot. Is basically the empirical distribution of a variable, like you see in a normal empirical distribution, but it's divided into two subgroups. So what you're seeing here is the distribution of income per capita in the year 2010 for low-income countries. That's the dark one here. It's a mirror image of the distribution. And here you have the distribution of income per capita for middle and high-income countries. Okay? Here you have, it's the log of GDP per capita, so you have the poorer countries here, richer countries here. And depending on whether you're a middle or high-income country or a low-income country, you have, you are on the upper distribution or in the lower distribution. The lines there are just the averages. Okay? So we start in 2010 with the same type of distribution for everybody, and what you see here is how those distributions look like in 2050 and in 2100 for each one of the SSPs over GDP per capita. Okay, so as you can see, they are basically representing exactly the type of story that you heard before from Erich. You have the middle of the road, so you do have, because you observe conditional convergence in the world in reality, so you're just projecting that further. You have extra increases in education that lead to more technology and more growth, so the whole world is becoming more equal in terms of between country income convergence and richer over time, right? In SSP1, of course, that is improved in the sense that you have richer countries on average as compared to SSP1 and more convergence. In SSP5, it's pretty much a very similar picture, and SSP3 and SSP4, as you can see, are completely different animals for different reasons, actually. So here you have the fragmented world. It's basically not letting any of those fixed effects that correspond to institutional quality, not letting them converge anywhere. So basically you are also projecting them to be constant over time. Then what happens is basically that you create a very spread distribution of income per capita. Poor countries remain poor in comparative terms, rich countries remain rich. And since everybody grows and poorer countries don't grow at higher rates than richer countries, then basically you end up with a very dispersed distribution of income per capita across countries. Here you have a pretty similar picture. However, it is caused by a polarization. So you do have some poor and middle income countries that become richer, but some others get stuck in a poverty trap, and you create a kind of a bimodal distribution in here. Okay, so now we have this guy, we have all the other guys, we put them together into the Human Development Index, and you get pretty much a very similar picture to the one that I showed you with income per capita. So this is the Human Development Index for 2010, 2025, 2050, and 2075. I'm stopping in 2075 because since I need those expected years of schooling, and for the moment I only had them till 2100, Samir told me he has them already for further, so now we can do this until 2100 as well. So we need to stop at 2075, at least for these projections. Okay? And as you can see, the picture, I'm not going to go very much into detail here, but the picture is pretty much the same as before. Please notice the Human Development Index, because of its relative nature, can only be compared within SSPs. It doesn't make any sense to compare numbers here with numbers here, because these guys refer to other maximum levels. That's a problem of the Human Development Index on its own, if you want to do different projections in different scenarios. Okay? Needless to say, the convergence patterns that you observe across the world are extremely different, which implies that depending on the type of world that you have in mind in terms of climate change and its effects, comparing today's Human Development Index or today's development measure of choice with whatever you think is going to happen may be a good idea, because there's no relationship between today's HDI and the future HDI, or it could be a horribly bad idea, because you would be basically underestimating, in many cases, the vulnerability or overestimating the vulnerability that you're going to have. Okay, that was it. What I did is to provide an internally consistent framework based on human capital dynamics in order to obtain projections of the Human Development Index. The beauty of this is that it is all driven by changes in population, by age, sex, and education, everything. There are assumptions, of course, on institutional quality, but they are relatively straightforward. The whole machinery here, the whole driving factor, is how people change. And it enters each one of the three components, and it makes sense in itself. It's a self-consistent type of setting. Okay, as you saw, we calibrated a set of Human Development Index projections corresponding to each one of the shared socioeconomic pathways. And in principle, the modeling framework is there. This is just one of the many things that you can do with it. So it's up to you to think of new ways in which you can assess the potential interaction between population, education, and income in the future. And if you want a consistent framework to think about it, here you have it already. Or you can work on this. Thank you.
Now the floor is open for questions. So maybe we can collect 3 questions, then okay, Stefan, then Emilia. Okay, Charles. Please make your comments or questions short.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I have a question to Erich. Just probably one comment and one question. The comment would be about the terminology of vulnerability in the depths, So maybe this, I think it relates probably to the old IPCC definition of vulnerability. So according to the new one, the deaths would be the impact, and the impact comes from the risk. So actually this would be kind of a estimation of the risk, let's say, or in regard to that. So probably I think that's just a comment on terminology. And the second one, I think I understand well what is being tried to achieve with this kind of projections. But maybe, you know, probably if I mentioned also in my presentation, the social scientists and others would say, okay, these things are too much complex, and also especially with vulnerability and all these factors contributing and outcome. And now we are trying to project it into the future. So what would you answer them? You know, saying, okay, are you now projecting concrete numbers into the future? And just, let's say, based on some little assumptions, let's say. And one issue would be also probably that also vulnerability factors may change in the future, what is contributing to that, but also the natural hazards, not only based on climate, but also on, you know, deforestation issues. So humans are also influencing the hazards as well. So, you know, just a provocative question. If people say, okay, what are the numbers for? What would be the answer to that?
So I have a question for Jesus. Well, it was a very, very impressive talk, and I really enjoyed it. I'm just thinking about the various relationships that you mentioned. If I understood correctly, you're saying that you're using education and population as exogenous, and they affect economic growth. And that makes sense, but I'm wondering if you have any sense of what if there were like other types of relationship, like economic growth and education may affect population and so on. Some of these may be already part of the projections, but some others may not be part of the projection. And so I was wondering if you get the sense of the sensitivity of these. And then one other question that's both for both talks. It's about extrapolating. So both of them are based on linear trends that you observe. So you estimate some linear models, and I was wondering if you have any sense of how far in the future linear relationship may persist. If you had thought about maybe there are some non-linearities and it makes sense to project 50 years in the future, or 30 or 100, and so on. Thank you.
Well, very informative. Yeah, two quick questions. One for Erich is, in terms of those of us who want to now use the 5 different SSPs, and we see overlap between some of them, like between 4 and 5, or maybe 1 and 3. Maybe you could help us in terms of what if we want to use SSP 5 for urban area, and 3 for rural area within a country. I mean, how interchangeable could it be? And in terms of Crespo, the question about the division, the transition from secondary to tertiary in a lot of poorest countries is not that straightforward. So there's this intermediate category where a lot of the vulnerable youth, when they finish they may not go to pre-university, but they end at 10, and then they go into technical, vocational, commercial, which are the most important. So would they be tertiary? Are they secondary plus? I'm not sure how we're going to project that, because that's the greatest growth for the vulnerable youth.
Yeah, thank you very much for that comment on the terminology, and sorry for being so sloppy about it. What I meant with talking about death as vulnerability is pretty much in the sense of it being a proxy of how vulnerable future societies are going to be. So based on that number, we predict on the number, on potential death. We can make an assessment of how vulnerable these societies are going to be. But of course, you're right. These things are very complex, as we have seen in the last days. Yeah, And that, of course, brings up the question if you can actually reasonably and convincingly project it into the future, and also how far you can actually do that. And of course, the further you go into the future, the less reliable the results are going to be. But what we have tried to do here was simply to show the enormous range that the different possibilities represented by the SSPs open up. So how different the outcomes in terms of future predicted number of deaths can be based on only this still rather limited information that we get from the SSPs. But of course, much more detailed information would be needed, particularly on the hazard side, for example. We haven't, I have shown you the results for SSP1 and SSP5, the sustainability scenario and the conventional development scenario. And the narrative behind these two SSPs describe two completely different worlds, and still the results turn out to be very similar for Africa, because I'm only looking at this human core of the SSPs, and as I have explained, migration, which is the only difference for Africa here, doesn't contribute much to the difference between SSP1 and SSP5. But of course, in a future that was created by conventional development, you also have much higher mitigation challenges, meaning much stronger hazards also, which these societies will be exposed to. And since I cannot really model the differences in the number of disasters according to SSP5 and SSP1, I have to leave that out of the picture. But it would, of course, and you're right, be very important to do that. I'm not really sure I can answer your question regarding the usability of the different SSPs with regard to rural-urban differences. Maybe Leiwen can tell you much more on this, because you've been doing work on urbanization based on the SSPs. Just one example of how this plays into what I have been doing here. The difference between SSP3 and SSP4 in terms of predicted number of deaths would actually be larger if I would use the full education detail, because these two scenarios are actually quite different, but in a subtle way, because you have in the inequality scenario more people with tertiary education, but at the same time also more people with just primary education. In the fragmented world scenario, it is less unequal, but if you collapse the education categories 5 and 6, like I did here, because I looked at the education share among the women 20 to 39 with at least secondary, meaning I combined categories 5 and 6 in the projections, this information is lost, and I'm hoping that in future work I can also eradicate this unclarity. Yeah. So, but if you want to answer to that.
Yep, I'm quickly answering anyway. Thanks a lot for the comments. I'll start with Emilio. On the endogeneity issue, it seems like I'm talking to economists now. They are very obsessed with that. What you saw in here are results from a standard fixed effects OLS model. So we did not take that into account explicitly in the results that you saw here. Now, I'm going to argue that it matters relatively little for the type of panel that we have, because the basic idea would be that in times of increased economic growth, you would invest more in the education of your kids. Since we have attainment levels and we are looking at 5-year growth spells, and we have 2 broad age groups, it's difficult to think that those, thanks to the fact that aging takes the same speed all over the world, it's difficult to think that that mechanism of endogeneity is going to be present there. However, in our paper on the demographic dividend that just appeared in demography, we took endogeneity extremely seriously. So we did a generalized method of moments estimation with whole lot of instruments and playing around. And the results we got were qualitatively identical. It's a matter of, I mean, you have a trade-off, especially in panels which are not so big, because if you take endogeneity seriously, you need to use lags as instruments, so you lose a lot of information in order to get to estimates which are relatively similar to those of fixed effects. So it's up to you. There's this famous paper in the Journal of Economic Growth that basically tells you don't care about endogeneity because you're just doing things worse in terms of parameter estimates for the type of panels that work, for the size of panels we have. So here we have not done anything against it based on the fact that when we did something against it, it did not change the results very much. On the linearity of trends, the overall trends that are not captured via our variables are there in the form of period fixed effects. So in that sense, it's a completely non-parametric trend. It actually goes up it's relatively low in the beginning of the 70s due to the oil crisis, then it goes up, then it goes down again. And then based on that non-parametric line, what we do is, in most of the SSPs, we just project it as some type of logarithmic trend. So something that goes on growing, but does not grow forever. Needless to say, it's just a matter of tweaking a parameter. So you can play around with that. In the framework of the work that we have done for the IPCC, I think that the results we got made sense. At least they were internally consistent, but I'm not going to claim here that those trends are going to go forever. They're projections, they're not forecasts. On the gray zone between secondary and tertiary, I find that also crucial and particularly important. We are, of course, limited by the existence of data. Also for the fact that, well, tertiary education as such is a social construct, right? Being a nurse is tertiary education in some countries, and it's not tertiary education in some other countries. I believe Elke has been working on finer vocational versus non-vocational groups for Austria, at least. I don't know if you did it also for some other OECD economies. For Austria.
In this SSP data, it's really completed post-secondary education. So even
Okay.
if it's only a 2-year course, but it needs completed first level of post-secondary, that's quite good.
Okay. However, I agree with you that examining that thing deeper, for which we would need anyway to expand the data, would be a really interesting avenue of research, especially when it comes to the technical versus non-technical skills, and yeah, that's all I can say.
Okay. Regarding the question about the rural-urban SSP use, make the long story short, and right now on the projection of urbanization is independent of other projections. Although we put them into the same line of scenarios, and we test the consistencies, it seems okay. And more importantly, this first set of scenarios is a global scenario, and for the future, and we need to extend the scenarios for different settings, rural, urban, in different countries, and that's something still a long way to go. So could we collect a lot around the question and make it short? And Keith, anyone else? Okay, Tan and Will. Okay, Keith, go ahead.
It's come, all right. Thanks. A question for Jesus. Thank you very much for really giving us a look at the kitchen of an economist and how you work. I found that very enlightening, actually. So the question here is like, we have seen you projecting Human Development Index to 2075. But I'm not convinced at all that we have seen a projection of vulnerability up to 2075. So actually Stefan also went into that direction. But I think in your presentation there's a graph in the third or fourth slide where you show a relation between HDI and deaths, I think, right? So that went a bit fast, but what I see, at least in the second one, is a horizontal line with a little curve there. So maybe you can, and I have the impression that this graph is that connection between HDI and vulnerability. So if I see that horizontal line, I'm not convinced, but maybe I missed something there. So maybe you can explain a bit. And sorry, can I just add one little thing? The bin diagrams at the end, I was interested to but I couldn't read them. I didn't know how they worked, what they actually showed. Yeah. So maybe later you can. Okay.
Yeah, that's, you have on the x-axis income per capita, and there you have just the distribution of income per capita. Like the empirical like a histogram, like a smoothed histogram. And you have two beans because that's the smooth histogram on the upper part for middle and high income countries, and in the upper part for low income countries.
What's the definition of middle and low? Because
Of course. Well, but that's partly a statistical smoothing problem. As you can see in the other case, you had also HDI before median and above median, and they were overlapping partly just because you're smoothing the data. Here they are just the World Bank definitions of it. So I just choose one. The idea is to represent how convergence patterns are taking place, because if you see that the two parts of the bean become a smaller bean and more to the right, then you can see beautifully how SSP1 converges or makes income converge much more than SSP3 or SSP4. That's the idea of it.
So the groups over time will not cross over?
No, that they're given, exactly. It's true, of course, that good point, but probably that was also led to some confusion. Low-income countries and middle or high-income countries are fixed at the year 2010, of course, so the people are not jumping or countries are not jumping. Should I answer directly the other question? Hi, yeah. At no moment did I claim that I was doing a projection of vulnerability. However, we believe that be it income, be it education, be it life expectancy, or be it the mixture of the three of them through the Human Development Index is just an important input to projections of vulnerability. So we see this as basically the first part of the cooking recipe that will lead to a wonderful thing to eat. Now, the motivation why the Human Development Index is a good ingredient to eventually project vulnerability is based on work that has been done already, and the upper one would be a good example of it. So this is the paper by Tony Patt and others at PNAS, and basically they show that there is up to a certain level of the Human Development Index, there is a clear relationship between increases in the Human Development Index and reductions in the number of people affected by natural disasters after controlling for other covariates. Okay, so basically I was just trying to motivate why people think in the literature that the Human Development Index would be a good input to learn about vulnerability in the future. I'm not claiming that you have the whole information in there, because as you can see, first of all, the fit is not perfect. Second of all, this is the fit after controlling for other things that are actually related to the type of projections that Erich was talking about, because what they are controlling for in here is total population, fertility, and stuff like that. So you would need to bring the HDI projections and the other projections and eventually extra information together in order to do a proper projected index of vulnerability. That was not at all the aim of the paper.
Okay. Sus? Hi. Okay. All right. So for catching up with technology, so is it comparable to skewed bias technological change? So I haven't followed the literature, but do you assume convergence But do some people find like evidence of divergence instead of convergence? So is it possible to assume differently, or what you have found about convergence is what you found in the data, not the assumption? Maybe can do different prediction or projection.
There you go. Yes, you're right. The idea of skill-biased technology change and the type of total factor productivity dynamics I have presented are related to each other. Basically, their mechanism, skill-biased technological change would be a consequence of having technology which is created by high-skilled people. Now, on catching up and income convergence, what you find in the data is conditional convergence. That is, after you control for characteristics of countries, you tend to find that the farther away countries are from the income per capita that would be implied by those characteristics, the quicker they are converging to it. Now, that does not imply unconditional convergence. And actually, if I show you the growth rate of income per capita of all countries of the world between 1970 and 2010, and the initial level of income in 1970, what you find is slight divergence. So there's basically nothing going on in terms of absolute convergence. Poorer countries on average are not growing more than richer countries. However, once that you control for the fact that poorer countries are different from richer countries in other respects, then you do tend to find that being poor, given all those other things, implies that you grow quicker towards your own steady state. To your own equilibrium. That's exactly the type of convergence that I'm referring to. Now, the SSPs, on the other hand, give you narratives that have to do with between-country convergence and with polarization across countries in the future. So those type of narratives we are including through our assumptions on what's going on with the fixed effects of our model, so with the equilibria to which countries are converging. So we are assuming, that's the second line there, what I call speed of income convergence. It refers to what's the speed of income convergence across countries. That is, how are the equilibrium income levels of countries becoming more similar over time? Okay? While within the model, each country has some speed of convergence to their own equilibrium. So there are two different, you have a within-country convergence and a cross-country convergence. Since you don't observe a cross-country convergence in the world, we are imposing it through the projections in order to make them feasible or to make them suitable for the SSP projections. I hope that was clear. If not, we can talk afterwards.
Okay, great. Due to time constraint, we have to stop here. Thank you for our two presenters. Thank you for everyone for the stimulating questions and discussions. So now we declare victory for all the sessions. Now I turn the chair to Wolfgang and Dr. Weppan.
Just go around the table and collect ideas, what comes to your mind after this session, and I hand over to Adrian now, maybe to start with a few words on the IOSSP.
Well, thank you. Yes, as Wolfgang mentioned, the current panel ends its term at the end of this calendar year, and we've done what we set out to do, and the council has said, okay, that's it, well done, you've done your job, and we're not going to be automatically extended. But they have invited us to make proposals in terms of what we think could be done, sponsored by the IUSSP in the future. That is to say, if we wanted to propose another panel, or maybe with a different mandate related to climate change, that's what we can do. So that's why I'm sitting on Wolfgang's left in this final concluding session. I guess the point of the concluding session is really to have some comments and feedback on the topic of differential vulnerability that we've been discussing for the last 2.5 days. But if you have a sense or a recommendation for how this work goes forward in the future, maybe think of ourselves as a research community, what would we like to do in the future? specifically focusing on those aspects that could be sponsored under a panel of the IUSSP, then please, this is a good time to make some comments. We're going to be talking as a panel after lunch further to try and crystallize some ideas. Of course, we've been focusing on differential vulnerability in this particular seminar. This is the second seminar that the panel has had. The first panel sponsored seminar had a broader mandate on population dynamics and climate change quite generally. And of course there is this whole other topic of mitigation that we haven't been talking about in this particular seminar because we talked about it before. It's a little bit difficult maybe, but if you had a recommendation about the mitigation side of things, you please feel free to make that too in this concluding session, even though we haven't been talking about that in this seminar. So I hope that's clear, but obviously the session is focusing on what we've done in this particular seminar, but if you want to make a recommendation as to what we could do as a research community in the future, focusing conceivably on other aspects of climate change as well, please do share your thoughts.
Well, I'm not sure whether this is imposing too much, but a good idea would be just to quickly go around the table and invite everybody to say one or two sentences what comes to mind, because some of the people have actively participated in the discussions, others have not very frequently expressed the views, but I'm sure they have views, and maybe, is this, well, you can just pass on if you want. Maybe I, Mark, can I start?
All right, thank you. My recommendation would be strongly to continue the work that we've seen represented here. I think the reason I say that is that I think that demographers and like-minded social scientists have a comparative advantage in dealing with the consequences of disasters and the consequences of climate change. But we have not exploited that comparative advantage. There's a lot to be done. To do it well would require reaching beyond the circle of demographers to humanitarian agencies, there's a wide world out there of other scholars in similar disciplines that are engaged in these issues. And it's very, very informative to hear from them, even if they don't quite know what the demographic implications are.
Well, my recommendation would probably be to continue this line of work, but also I've been talking a lot to Leiwen, who has been working on integrating assessment with both trying to put the whole picture together of mitigation and adaptation together with climate models, and probably I think that suggesting something in that direction, like in working together with climate scientists and so on for an integrated model could be something that is relevant.
I think that after this seminar and the seminar before, there is two groups working on population and climate change issues. One dealing with global models and another dealing with local studies. And I think that could be very interesting to start to see what those two groups have in common and how to integrate, scaling up or scaling down, the results and input that each of them have. So this kind of looking at the scale of the research and also the implication of that and how both of them have to do with the same topic but from different perspectives. I think that integration could also lead to more research, more question, and also a way of reaching out and learn from the policy community too.
Another aspect that I noticed through the last two days and a half and in most of the existing research is on this type of subjects, especially the more you want to go at the individual level. Right now, everyone has been, whoever has been collecting data, has been collecting it in its own way, pretty much freestyle. It makes it very difficult to compare things, within country and between countries. We know and we have the experience within the demographic community of having learned the benefits of promoting and using internationally comparable survey instruments. In the context of what we have been discussing here, whether it's about adaptation, about resilience, about vulnerability, and so on, right now, to my knowledge, there is no real, let's say, social survey instrument that has been developed and promoted and can be used as a kind of core questionnaire that, whether it's an academic research project, it's an international organization, an NGO who wants to collect something about one or several of the aspects we have discussed here today, that should be promoted as basically, instead of trying to invent the wheel, when it comes, for example, to survey questions, the World Bank has been building basically a database of questionnaires, and I've been analyzing thousands of survey questionnaires and codifying them. So if you go to the World Bank, especially for the gender database, you will see and be able to search what has been asked and how it has been asked across thousands of surveys. When it comes, for example, to measuring access to water, the way the questions are asked in census and in surveys can be so different that at the end what you're measuring is not comparable. We had the same problem in the past when it came to contraception or to fertility and so on. When it comes to the concepts we are discussing here right now, I think there is a lot of very simple, very basic work that doesn't really cost any money in trying to harmonize and standardize and promote something. That would be my recommendation, how the panel could serve as a forum to do that.
Yeah, I'm not sure what IUSSP has an opportunities to support on, so that's not, I'm not aware about that, but probably just some brainstorming, some ideas to go. I think one could be, should be of course building now on this kind of risk framework and a risk propeller, let's say, proposed by the IPCC, because to these propellers they attached many different models, like the impact models on the hazard side and from the vulnerability side. So I think IUSSP can specifically support on the vulnerability side and the societal side, let's say. One recommendation, of course, which came out of my presentation was to have also this kind of downscale, let's say, disaggregated population data. I don't know if this is a opportunity to contribute to. And in general, I think also a third point would be, and I think that was interesting for me to learn from, let's say, demographers, because I'm a geographer or a GIS person, is the models kind of you're doing, because this provides, let's say, evidence-based information about what is contributing to vulnerability. So this reflects, of course, later to the choice of indicators and to the weightings of that if you want to go to a vulnerability index. And I think such kind of evidence-based analysis, I think it's quite interesting, it's quite lacking at the moment. And fourth point probably would be also to go to the global level. I think that also goes a little bit into this direction of your survey information. There's a lot of survey data out there, like DHS. We also used that in our Eastern African assessment. So I think this is also an interesting gap probably to close from this global stuff going more to the regional and local scale levels.
Thank you. As regards my suggestions, probably I would suggest that there could be more we're dealing mainly with demography in this field, but I think a convergence with other fields would give us more focused information that can, for me, my own work. I would like my own work to be used and really contribute directly on a local level. So that's why I tried to establish a national level database that can focus on particular hotspots. And then on that national, we have all those limitations of scale at that broad stroke. But then we now know we can then focus. I mean, if we have to focus on everything, we're just lost. So with the hotspots that we can identify at that scale, then we can do some more very focused interventions and research. I think that would be very helpful for adaptation and resilience. Thank you.
Yeah, I've seen, I think during this workshop, sort of a divide between papers that were strong on the differential vulnerability and that were often not so strong on the exposure side and the hazard side. So it's like vulnerable to what? Like often those that were strong on differential vulnerability were not so were very close to poverty, like vulnerability as poverty, right? And then there were these other papers which were strong on the other side, like the exposure, the specific hazards, etc. But quite silent about social differential vulnerability. So maybe for a next seminar, it could be an idea to sort of couple people. I don't know whether that's practical or feasible at all, but pairing people, maybe a demographer with a more physical scientist or a more geographer, that could you know, maybe give some interesting results. And having said that, I think I would have met a few people in this seminar, which I'm really glad to have known, because maybe we will, you know, approach each other to work together on these and benefit from each other's skills.
Okay, thank you. Just two suggestions. The first one is it will be better if we can include more and more policy makers and politicians. Of course, you had yesterday from municipality and the like, but it will be better if you have a lot of these guys and the civil society as well. The second one is just to have more cooperation and information exchange between scholars. Okay, thank you.
Personally, was really, I've benefited a great deal from thinking about the sort of scaling up and scaling down and potential sources of data for future projects. So I thank everyone for stimulating my thinking about how I might think of these questions in the future. But one thing I was thinking about, and I don't think I even do a very good job of this, but I'm coming from a policy school, although I tend to focus more on a demographic aspects of these issues, but I think it could be really interesting to incorporate institutional capacity as maybe a source of adaptation potential, or even perhaps a source of vulnerability. So I'm not quite sure how to do that, but maybe it is bringing policymakers to the table, or even just thinking about these in our models. I know in several presentations, institutions are assumed to be fixed, so I'd be curious to see how playing with that piece might change the conversation. Thank you.
So thank you. I would like to suggest, I look forward to the project of IUSSP in the future, wherein disaster managers will work with the demographers and geographers, as well as with the policymakers, in order to provide with these disaster managers with scientific evidence, in order for them to come up with policies that would address issues on adaptation, mitigation, and preparedness. Because presently, although we have existing policies, but sometimes they are based on the traditions, and sometimes it's not within the context of scientific evidences. Thank you.
Well, it is a very good experience to be part of this group, and since I am from an environmental science side, this is my first time to meet demographers, and I've seen that the way demographers look at social vulnerability is quite different from from those looking at the biophysical side. So I agree with the convergence with other disciplines, and I think that is also the reason why we have different definition, because from different field. But this seminar is very inspiring, especially for a young researcher like me, who is planning to pursue a PhD. So I think this is very enlightening.
Okay, I have three suggestions for IOSSP. Two are more on the technical side. One we did discuss in Busan, and that is on the sources of data, the quality and consistency of the sources of data, both cross-sectional and, of course, I advocate longitudinal and panel data. And in particularly, the elephant on the table has been migration, I think. Well, I'm a little biased. But anyway, in terms of the vulnerability of the growing populations which are using not what we measure permanent, but they're often using irregular or short-term or circular or seasonal migration, and it's not being measured. Now, it's true in some surveys it is being measured, but we measure it in different ways. But often we don't have the data that's measuring the coping and short-term and adaptation of the vulnerable population. So that's on the sources of data. The second is on the concepts. I think there's been a transition from dealing with, let's say, risk and vulnerability now to adaptive capacity and resilience. And we've discussed this in coffee, that some of the major donors like DFID and USAID are totally into resilience. We've hardly discussed that before, and really what do they mean by that? So this continuum between coping, resilience, and adaptation is something that really, as scientists, we really got to understand. And the more, you might say, policy-oriented, I think we have to be a little bit more historical and learn from the from the past or the recent past of our experiences in trying to deal with adaptive capacity, particularly to slow evolving events. And Latin America has a lot of capacity, a lot of experience, but it hasn't been shown here. And even a country like Ethiopia has had an early warning system since the 70s. And what has worked and what hasn't worked? I think we have to learn. So I would suggest that I used to speak in commission evaluations of the experience of trying to build adaptive capacity so we can move forward in the future.
My comment is that we have to look at the landscape of the research and what has been done in the past, what we have achieved, and what the expertise we have, what the large community of climate change research and even social scientific research on climate expect us to contribute to, and we can do a lot of things, but we have to understand what will be the most reasonable, important contribution that the larger community expect us to have. And we have been working on the mitigation issues, and we, of course, there are always a lot of work to do still. But what is lacking and what is expected from the larger community is more like some of us has mentioned that demography differential, vulnerability, capacity, and even resilience, and the data issues, and also the cross-scale understanding the global model and meso level analysis and even micro level analysis. Those are the things we can talk about, and we have to narrow our interest and to do something like other panels. You know, there could be many other panels proposed to IUSP. What we can do is that we have our niche.
Thank you very much. This has been a very interesting and inspiring seminar that I have attended. And my comment is that we have, myself, I have learned a lot about about vulnerability and from all the presentation, and I would like to see this forum to continue and the exchanging information, research that has been done, because, for example, Indonesia in one of the country that prone to disaster, and we have also conducted several studies on the disaster, but we may need to have like exchange and then collaboration with other colleagues in this area, so that we could we have like, for example, similarity with Thailand, and we would like also to have a forum like this to have more exchange of ideas, exchange of research finding from other Asian countries, because I see that many of the presentations that less from the Asian countries. So I would like to see that more our contribution to this topic. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to say two things. First, that I feel that we demographers and population scientists have a little less explored this phenomena like vulnerability and disaster. We demographers and population scientists, I feel that we have less explored this phenomena. And the first thing that hit my mind is that when we even try to look into those phenomena, the first thing that strike in my mind is that we first think that whether the data is available or not, whether the true kind of data is available or not. Like Montgomery sir was presenting, he devoted quite a lot of time on that dissemination of the data, that this kind of data is available, one can go for that data also. So my suggestion would be like, we can disseminate some kind of data maybe in IUSP website, maybe there may be one column, or through email we can send. The first, and the second thing is that we, this natural disaster vulnerability, this is a very multifaceted discipline kind of thing. If we can include natural scientists, like maybe geologists, geographers, climatologists, they can give a very different kind of argument regarding all those things. So I think we should consider those things also. Thank you.
Thank you. What I have to say comes back to a comment that Charles Teller made earlier, and that's something I've been wondering about too. So if there's some agreement that education does play a crucial role when it comes to adaptive capacity, I think what has to follow is to look at which education transitions matter most, like in what context is it really the transition from primary to secondary, or from secondary to post-secondary or tertiary, and because I suspect that there's a difference depending on what context we're in, what level we look in. So I think there's a clear need for more case studies that look at various levels and which education levels matter. Thank you.
Thank you. If you notice what we have been trying to do in this conference and also in the special issue in ecology and society that you all have the hard copy by now, we have tried to provide also the consistent evidence at different level. So from individual level, household, community, regional, global level into outer space, like the work of Jesus, for example. So So on your way back home, if you look at ecology and society, in that case, the focus is on education. And there is a consistent pattern on the impact of education on lowering down risk, but at a different outcomes as well. So it's sort of, I guess, the kind of seminar like this, or a book or a special issue that provide, because one couldn't look at one unit of analysis, it has to be different scales and also different outcomes. Thank you.
It has been said several times, but it cannot be repeated often enough that it is really very important that this kind of forum stays outside the ivory tower, and I liked it very much that yesterday we also had some people invited here who gave us their view from their communities. I mean, of course, a lot of the field work that has been presented also build up very strongly on the experience of the people who were affected by the disasters, actually. But I just wanted to highlight that I think that this is a very important thing, this connection to the outside world, and as several others now have already said, also the connection to other fields of research, especially natural scientists, that also seems to me to be something that has to be strengthened.
Okay, so it's been a whole lot of fun, and let me just point into a couple of things that I was missing, actually. Since the breadth of research topics that we've been touching upon has been impressive, and the variety of methods still in the same type of scientific language. We understand each other without the necessity of being experts in whichever method the other person is using. There were, however, a couple of things that I was missing, and I was thinking eventually will come up, and probably this can give us some insights into either future invitations of certain type of researchers or into movements in terms of our own research. Of course, to a certain extent, it's also biased by the type of research that I have been doing lately. We heard yesterday about how the effects of the tsunami here were conditioned by the fact that certain parts of the coast had been deforested prior to the tsunami, which is something like the dark side of development, meaning we have solved development. I have solved development 10 minutes ago as a way of achieving a reduction in vulnerability. However, within that complex relationship between development and vulnerability that we need to simplify, there are certain interactions and certain aspects which go in the opposite direction, and that for sure would deserve to have a closer look. So this is as an example of something I've been working on and that I think is important, is this idea of deforestation and indirect changes or indirect increase in vulnerability through development that interacts with the environment in a kind of a more perverse way than we would expect it to be.
All right, so I really think that I know very little about the nature of the IUSSP's work and the community, so it might not be fair for me to give any recommendation. But for the past 3 days, it's been very stimulating, and I think my perspective has been broadened so much, both in terms of ideas and methodology. So now I think like projection is the coolest thing ever now. But one thing that could be useful, I think, coming from development economics background, so I think that the topics that we are interested in are overlapping a lot, and I think demography has so much to offer to other social science research community. Not that we as economists coming to your conference, but I really would like to see demographers exploring, expanding into like other fields, because I think like demographers deserve like place, especially in development economics, that I haven't seen. I haven't been to any conference in development economics that have demographers in it, but I have seen conference for demography that have economists in it. So I think you have so much to offer, like in terms of like technology, if you can say, and ideas as well. It would be wonderful, I think. Okay. Yeah.
I have suggestions less on science, but more on this continuation of this spirit that we saw here. So we saw that this kind of meeting, the topic that we are discussing, it's kind of evolving, and we experienced and we saw the lack of data, evolving of data methodologies, at the same time the lack of those. So I think one of the main things that we have to think how to do is how to move forward and how to let not die this kind of meetings or this kind of spirit. So I think it's important to think about the next seminar already. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, I thought it was a really lovely seminar, so I want to thank the organizers again. And I'm going to repeat some things, but you see where I'm sitting, so I think that's fair. After everyone is gone, obviously some things are always going to be said. As a migration specialist, and I lean towards sociology, I think, again, this point about interdisciplinarity is really important, and again, not just what we can bring as social scientists to demography, but what demography can do for us, and more of an explicit conversation. Because I think generally when we talk about disciplines working together, we talk about them very individually. So like even if you have a panel on demography and then you have a panel on economics or sociology, trying to really explicitly find ways to bridge not just methodologically, but for example, when we see a lot of this information about individual, household, community, well, we're also not knowing locally and regionally what those terms even mean. So I think that's something that sometimes can be brought from other, like education, for example, or migration. How is that locally perceived of as a strategy to adapt or a vulnerability? Because sometimes when we have a lot of models, I think we lose a bit of the local element. And maybe in conversation with that, we can see things like kinship structure and historical influences. And then lastly, I think, again, the point about concepts is really important. I think we had the starting point where we had a model which was very interesting and laid out what we're looking at with in terms of vulnerability and risk. But I think it's also to be important to be as explicit about what we're not using and why we're not using it. So we bring up resilience. Why isn't resilience put into the model? There's obviously many reasons it's not, but being a bit more explicit about what terms we're using and what we mean and why we're not using others and what we don't mean.
I was happy to not be the first one to talk, and I can say I'm not more happy to be the last one. Because, yeah, we are not twins, but I was more or less thinking exactly the same. I guess it's because we have talked a lot about what we were listening to, and yeah, it was so interesting. What I would like to say, and perhaps I will go back to a discussion I had with this case yesterday, is that actually, okay, we have, all of us, we have our own specialization, we have our own core of literature, and okay, I don't want especially that demographers become more, yeah, coming in my field, I would say, and begin to just use also all the methods of demographers. But I also think we can more think about how our methodologies, our way to enter in a subject can make a bit more kind of a exchange of that, kind of a dialogue between our methodologies, our way to enter in to define a subject, how to begin to design the research project and so on. because I really think it's something that we sometimes miss a bit. I was listening some participants and I was thinking, oh, I must write that. I haven't heard about that. Oh, this is the thing. And I think I had a list with 20 different books to read. But I was also thinking, oh, I think perhaps they missed that. And this is a thing, you know, just the experience that all of us, we have years after years, researches after researches. We learn so much about our colleagues, people we meet in seminars and workshops like today. And I really think we need to perhaps find a way to even more, find a way just to, I don't know, kind of workshop about dialogue between our methods on this specific field at the end. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all so much. This has been very rich and very enlightening, and we took careful notes, so this will really enter the discussion of the committee after lunch. And since time has progressed, this is the end of the conference. I now pass the floor to Vipan to say the concluding comments.
Before the conclusion, I would like to give my opinion to... Okay. I also would like to give my opinion also on this issue because I think that this vital issue should be carried forward through conducting more comparative study and regular organizing seminars. And in the next step, we should also try to communicate or translate our research findings to policy and practice. For example, we should present our research findings and suggestions to local government and policy planner in Khao Lak community. This way, our work will have strong impact not only on the scientific sphere, but on the well-being of the population in the study country or in the study community as well. Yeah. Okay, I think time flies, doesn't it? In closing this important seminar, I would like first to thank all participants for coming and providing very fruitful presentation and discussion. I would like to give special thanks to Professor Wolfgang Lutz for initiating this seminar and for his contribution to the advancement of the population study in the aspect of demographic differential vulnerability to the natural disasters. I also would like to extend my sincere thanks to Professor Adrian Hay, Chair of the Scientific Panel on Climate Change, and all scientific committee for selecting very insightful papers. I would like to give special thanks to Dr. Raya Muttarak, who put great deal of effort in arranging this seminar in both scientific contents and all logistics. And I also would like to thank all CPS staff members and students, especially Kin, Non, and Tumai, who put a great deal of effort in providing and very helpful assistance, and also all the hotel staff who give very good service to us. So please give all them a big hand. I think you all agree with me that this seminar achieved its objective, especially in highlighting how demography could contribute to better understanding the complex relationship between demographic difference, vulnerability, natural disaster, and adaptive capacity. This seminar also provides very useful information for further development of theoretical framework and analytical method in this field. I hope you will all continue working on this issue, not only for your own academic interest, but also for the well-being of the mankind. So I wish you all have a safe trip home, and please keep in touch.
as well. Thank you. Lunch is up.